actually got the right outfit on this time. Sorry about that for last time. I'm sure most of you didn't even notice until I pointed it out. So this episode's interesting for a couple of reasons. We're still kind of maneuvering forward, aren't we? First of all, yes, Scott Adams made a cameo in this, looking for his dog and his cat, who are planning to take over the galaxy. Just point it out, because if I don't, people will think I missed it. I have to admit, it's actually one of the very, very few times I've actually heard Scott Adams talk. And I don't know, I don't have anything else to add to that, it's just amusing. It is funny to me because I was actually pretty big into Dilbert back when this show was coming out live. And then I stopped being into Dilbert because he started doing different kinds of jokes, and they started getting a little bit too real. No, seriously. When it gets to the point where you see a Dilbert joke and says, yeah, that just happened to me last week. Not exaggeratively, but that actual thing happened to you last week. That's the moment when Dilbert stops getting to be funny. Anyways. So we see Garibaldi is getting closer to Edgar's in his overall presentation. We're seeing more and more of Edgar's as this comes out. Now, interesting thing, some people were speculating when these episodes were going live. I remember actually a distinct conversation I had with Rob, a friend of mine at the time, who was like, dude, I think Bester is Edgar's. Now, I didn't think that at the time, but it's funny looking back how much evidence there is supporting that theory. Bester is just a little bit, like the things that go his way are just a little bit too well positioned. They're just too convenient, you know what I mean? Everything just kind of falls right into his lap, as if it had all been planned that way. Now, again, I remind you guys we have a no spoiler policy to decide whether or not, it's true whether or not Edgar's and Bester are the same people. But it is interesting to see the similarities. Most notably, Bester, this is the biggest point right here, Bester reaches out to Lita, says, I want your body. By which he means he wants to dissect her in order to learn what the Vorlons did to her. And then Kefka goes flying by, and she says no, of course, and then she gets kicked out of her apartment, and then kicked out of her job. By Edgar's, basically. And then Bester gets what he wants. Interesting. However, and there's also another piece of evidence, and this is crucially important, and I'm sure you guys noticed this, either your first time around, or if you're watching this for the first time with me. Bester's comments during his personal log, nice reference by the way, make it pretty clear that he is in fact doing something with Garibaldi. We don't know what, we know nothing about it, but he makes clear and demonstrable reference to the fact that he is maneuvering Garibaldi into a specific position, and that makes sense. Not only do the two have a personal history together, but he actively went way out of his way to provoke Garibaldi for what amounts to no other reason other than to push him into a specific direction, which succeeded, it is worth noting. In fact, the only reason that might not have worked perfectly in distancing Garibaldi from the rest of the command staff is Zack. Also, interesting point of note, Bester did keep his word. He didn't actually interact with the command staff, because Garibaldi quit, and Lita isn't actually part of the inner clique. Now that last part is interesting to me. I feel like Sheridan and those who are in charge made a grievous error when they didn't decide to add her to the payroll, add Lita to the payroll. Now, don't misunderstand me, I understand that would be a bite. They are financially starved right now. However, not only would that allow them to have a powerful and valuable ally and asset, and someone who's kind of become, part of the inner clique anyways, thanks to the Shadow War on their side, and, the whole friend morality thing on top of that, but it would also prevent exactly what happened from happening, because Lita's having trouble finding a job. And that's one of the things I find interesting about this episode, is on the Babylon 5 side of things, everything's nice and mundane. I've often theorized that one of the reasons writers pull those kind of things into stories is to make them more relatable. While there are underpinnings and realities of money, economies, and why they function and why they are basically necessary for a society, let me go into this really quick, just really quick, okay? Let's say you're really good at telling stories. I'll use something that's close to my own relatability in your particular species or culture or whatever. And let's say you're hungry. Well, Is that food? Like if you go and try to tell stories for food, is that food always going to be available to be given to you? I'm constructing this analogy badly. The point is, if it was so easy and simple to just say, to perform one service in exchange for another, or to give one good in exchange for another, then we would never have need of currency or any kind of money. There would still be an economy, but it would be an economy of trade. But trade only works under certain circumstances, and sadly enough, food is probably one of the biggest flaws in a barter economy, because food goes bad, and food takes time to grow, and food takes time to harvest, or catch, or farm, or ranch, or whatever else you want to call it. Food is, in many ways, the true linchpin of all human economy, and as weird as that probably sounds. And it's understandable why you need some kind of fungible currency whose only actual purpose is to serve as a medium of trade. However, that's at the base level, the level that most people don't think about, which is why I'm bringing this up. Because when you go up to a more modern level, a level at which, you're just dealing with your everyday life, you're not thinking about how much you need to pay your bills or to get food or to, be able to to have entertainment or whatever. That's not actually what tends to enter your mind, is it? Instead, what enters your mind is, well, I need money, because you understand that money is how you get those things. But a lot of the focus tends to go on the money side of the things, rather than what money's purpose is, thereby leading to an artificial inflation, not of economic inflation, but a psychological inflation of the value of currency itself. When currency doesn't actually have any intrinsic value. It is actually completely worthless. Its only value is what it can do for you. Its only value is as a medium of trade. This key distinction is an interesting thing to think about. Now, why am I bringing this up with regards to this episode? Because Lita Alexander is a powerful, super mega telepath who has connections to the command staff of Babylon 5 and who was involved in the Shadow War. You'd think, on the face of it, that in all those things she would be fine. But she needs to pay bills. She needs money. Because money is what has become the focus for most modern societies. This is not me preaching, by the way. This is just fact. Most people put the value on the money itself rather than what money can do for people. And this is true in fiction as well. So Babylon 5 needs money to keep functioning. And therefore, they either haven't or can't reached out to Lita to put her on the payroll, therefore leading her to value money as such that she has this problem. And all of this, of course, boils this down in a way that you, the modern everyday viewer, can look at this and completely relate. It's a nice way to humanize things, in other words, because it gives you a character who is incredibly powerful psychic, who has saved worlds, who has to worry about paying the rent. It's a nice touch. That, of course, leads to some interesting things. First of all, I hate to keep pointing this out, but he keeps doing it. Once again, Garibaldi decides to misdirect rather than to answer questions, most notably when Zack confronts him. It's so textbook, I thought about just writing down every line of dialogue and then just repeating it for you, because it is so overt the way Garibaldi misdirects. Yeah, you're working for this people. Are you okay with this? No, I'm okay with it. Every time he's asked a question, he takes one nugget out of it, and then just rants at it with that sort of, kind of a tone. Completely goes in a different direction with it, and doesn't actually answer the question. Speaking of which, there we have Bester. Now, we've already known at this point that Bester has his own faction amongst Psi Corps, for lack of a better term. And we don't actually know at this point how many different factions function at the Psi Corps. What we do know is Bester has demonstrably shown his interest, his focus, his party platform, if you will, is the advancement of the human race through telepaths, that the Teeps are actually the superior species. And he wants to advance them forward and become Khan, Noonien, Singh, and yet, you get it, right? You get it. Superior ability breeds superior ambition. I'm with it. Cool. I mention that because even if he had nothing to do with Garibaldi, which, as I said, we already have proven he has, his going way out of his way to accomplish all this, and the risk that this entails to him, and the cost that this entails to him, is all therefore worth it, because even if he has to deal with the politics or the mundane reality, he's still willing to put up with that for for the cause he believes in. And this makes Bester a brilliant parallel to Lita. Lita is having troubles with the mundane, but was willing to put up with it for the sake of her cause. Bester is having troubles with the mundane, but is willing to put up with that for the sake of his cause. Now, the only reason that this is not a complete parallel is that thanks to certain events, which are a little coincidental, Bester gets his way. Lita does not. Bester advances his cause. Lita fails at hers. And that scene where she's looking in the mirror at the end makes it so clear that she understands what this means to her, that we understand what this means to her. It's not just the symbolism. There's a morality involved here. There's an ethical concern here. There's a sentimentality attached with her having to pretend that she's still Psychor. As Bester points out, she's not actually Psychor. They're not going to give her orders. But that doesn't change the fact that she has to run around saying, yeah, I'm Psychor. And I totally get where she's coming with that, because I tend to be a sentimental bastard myself. Just checking my notes here. It is nice to see that Sheridan is once again unable to sleep for worry. We already know Sheridan's a bit of a worrier. Delenn herself has actually flat out called that out. Let's talk about the Minbari Civil War. So one of the reasons I didn't want you guys to give away spoilers in the previous episode was because of this episode. See, I don't know anybody who was watching Babylon 5 when it came out, who I was talking to about it at the time, who saw this coming. The previous episode was in many ways slanted to be the establishment of a grand Minbari civil war, and then it's over in this one. Boom! Now, it's solved in a very decisive way, and a very Minbari way. As usual, we see that Minbari politics has a lot to do with symbolism, and a lot to do with tradition. We also see a lot of symbolism on display, both in the directing and the acting of the presentation. Shakiri, there's this great bit where, for the good of the city, for the good of our people, I will raze that city to the ground and kill everyone in it. Which is kind of messed up to begin with. And it brings up an interesting question, actually. How exactly do Minbari civilians work? Just an odd question. Just kind of keep that in the back of your mind, because I have said many times that the civilian concept is really important to me, partially because of the military background and part of my family, and the whole military ideal thing I've talked about before on this show. So, you don't go after civilians. Do the people in that city qualify as civilians? I mean, are all religious caste fighting the war equally against all the warrior caste? Is that how that works? I don't know, but food for thought. So Shakiri does something interesting when he's talking to Narun. He mentions, he basically repeats Lanier's lines from some time ago. The last time that Narun and Delenn kind of headbutted, Marcus was actually the one that got in the way. A couple of funny notes about that. First of all, Lanier kind of talked around the fact that Marcus might have died by basically saying, we all die at some point, blah, blah, blah. That's pretty much what Shakiri says to Narun. But the other interesting thing is that Narun mentions how it was a bit of a revelation for him, what Marcus was going through. And Marcus says, next time you have a revelation, can you make it a little less painful? Unfortunately, it looks like Narun was not able to keep that vow, because, whooah! But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Shakiri's arguments are interesting, and this is the kind of style of writing I've noticed JMS does a lot of. This has actually happened back with mini packs as well. They did the exact same tactic. We want to do this, logic, reason, believability, being reasonable, not just logical. So, yes, we should do this. And, maybe this thing over here, and maybe this thing over here, and then maybe we'll do this. And then I contradict what I earlier said, because I have moved the conversation forward to a new point. And they kind of segue between the points that if you're not really paying attention, you don't notice it. But Shakiri flat out says, I care about lives as much as you do. Fast forward several sentences. I will kill as many people as I need to make this happen. That's one example, just one example of what he's talking about. And then he gives an almost callous disregard. Actually, I shouldn't say almost. Actually, in my notes here, I scribbled out the word almost. He gives a callous disregard for the lives of the people who he is willing to both send into battle and whom they are killing. Now, that's significant as well because it makes him, to be blunt, a typical, well, I don't have a way to say it, the typical leader. Now, whether that's a good trait or a bad trait, that's a lot more debatable. But it does make him typical, whereas Delenn is not. Delenn is a front runner. Delenn is kind of a Cisco in this situation, to bring a Star Trek parallel into us. Cisco would rather not be behind lines giving orders. Cisco would rather be on the front lines giving orders, sharing this front with his troops. Now, that is not a tactical decision. That is not a leadership decision. That's not a strategic decision. That is purely a moral decision, a sentimental decision. You notice the kind of recurring theme there. Because it matters. It matters to Delenn that she be the one to be willing to give this sacrifice. Yes, it's one thing to order. She even says it in her speech. It's one thing to order people to go and fight and die and kill. It's a total another thing to be able to willing to do that yourself. Now, yes, I do understand, and I'm sure a lot of you are going to bring this up, that there's a lot of arguments that can be said against that mentality. But that's why I make the distinction that is not a tactical choice, but a sentimental one. It is more about being willing to be more right rather than to being more correct. So, interestingly enough, there's the big scene. A quick question. It's obvious based on a few bits of dialogue that Naroon was pretty much, this was all part of the plan that Delenn and Naroon had put together. But do you think Naroon was actually thinking about betraying her at any point in time? What I mean by this is I have a feeling that Naroon hadn't, shall we say, fully decided, that he hadn't fully committed to one side or the other until he started interacting with Shakiri. And Shakiri and his callous disregard for life and his pandering and his cowardice and his self-interest are probably the kind of things that really disgusted Naroon. Even more so because if you'll remember, and I hope you do because this is super relevant, the big reason why Naroon was so anti-Delenn was because he assumed she was what Shakiri is. He thought she was trying to set herself up as some messianic leadership, I will rule our people in power, which is what Shakiri actually is and is actually doing. Now, another important thing about the Minbari, I know I've talked about it before, they're really big on symbolism and tradition. There's a scene where she's standing in the light, and if you haven't seen this episode or you don't really know what's going on, you might be forgiven to think, okay, what's the significance? Because it's not really showing much, because she's fine. Until Shakiri walks into the light and wilts under it. The sight of her standing strong, that's the first time we start to see her strain, too, by the way. And the sight of him barely able to endure it, begging her to leave, begging her to bow out. And then he finally relents himself. That's when we get across the point. And, of course, the whole, she is willing to stand strong and he is self-interested, or at least doesn't have the kind of will and discipline she does. And that part's the important part to me, because if you take sentimentality or morality or rightness or wrongness or anything like that out of the equation, what we are left with is one leader who has a tremendous will and one who doesn't. However smart he may be, however skilled he may be at war, however powerful he might be, he's not the kind of leader I would follow, because he has no fricking backbone. She does. And you can't tell me that a lot of Minbari don't value backbone. So then Naroon does something. Now that's the part I find very interesting. Actually, before I get to that, he has this line where he walks up to Shakiri, and he starts questioning him. Keep in mind, they're on a live broadcast to every Minbari on the planet. And he starts questioning the military caste's leadership right there on, live stream, basically. Now, Shakiri immediately perceives it from the political. Again, he is what Naroon was afraid Delenn was. He says, are you choosing their side? He perceives this as a political attack. And it is Naroon who shoots back, no, my side is my people, regardless of caste. It's actually probably the first time we really see one of the Minbari involved in this whole thing really diverse the difference between caste and people. Narun was willing to stand up for his people. And then he does something brilliant. Almost, it's so brilliant, I'm going to fail at explaining it to you. Narun, military caste, high-ranked leader, well-respected war hero, walks up there, gets Delenn out of there, and while in the flame, converts to religious caste. So, the military caste walked in and stood in and died because he did it. The religious caste walked in and stood in and died because he did it. Someone amongst the warrior caste was willing to stand up as strongly as the religious caste was because he was willing to die in Delenn's place, therefore showing that the military caste did have leaders with backbone, even though Shakiri didn't. In this one fell swoop, he has unified those two castes symbolically, and again, big on symbolism, and he's also ensured that there's not going to be this huge backlash, because if he hadn't done that, the military caste would have been screwed. Yeah, I mean, no, they're going to win the war, right? Except a warrior caste with nothing to back them is a paper tiger. They're not going to be able to do anything. And if all of the rest of Minbari, and probably several of the other warrior caste as well, started turning against them because their leader, because the military caste was being represented symbolically on live television with every Minbari on the frickin' planet, and possibly further, by a guy who was a sniveling wimp who refused to have a backbone or stand up for himself, there would have been hella backlash if that had gone down that way. But, thankfully, instead what we have is a situation in which Narun does that. And, of course, this also works better because of his earlier lines. I am for my people, not just for my, for my caste. Brilliant maneuver. It's so brilliant, it's interesting to me because based on the construction of things, and now that we can spoil, what was going on that I couldn't talk about last episode, it's pretty clear this was not part of the plan. This was not part of Narun's plan, Delenn's plan, or their plan. This was just something Narun came up with on the fly. And the funny thing is, I don't think he did it deliberately. In character, I don't think Narun was being Machiavellian here. I don't think he was planning out all of the subtleties and the intricacies that I just talked about. I think he just did what he felt was right, and it so happened to line up perfectly with Minbari mentality, because, well, Minbari mentality tends to be a lot about what is and what is right. Now here's where things get interesting. Almost this entire time, the worker caste has been almost universally ignored. In fact, I would not be surprised if some of you guys, when you got up to this point of the episode, kind of forgot the worker caste even existed. They reference them from time to time, but we haven't seen any major worker caste characters. They haven't been part of the politics. We haven't examined their culture. We have seen a lot of the military caste, a lot of the religious caste, major characters from both, a civil war between both, but not the workers. I postulate to you the theory that the worker caste are the Minbari equivalent of civilians. Which is as good a time as any to define the word civilians. Don't worry, I'm going somewhere with this. Civilians, to put the simplest layman's definition possible, are those caught in the middle. Everyone who is not a civilian is someone who is working actively in service towards an overall organization. Military is the obvious and easiest way to do that. Government also qualifies. In a culture that is like the Minbaris, the religious caste would also be not civilians, by definition. The workers, however, the ones who are that support structure, they would technically qualify as civilians. Now, I know this actually can and has been argued for years, for decades, for probably centuries actually, but I know at least for decades, going far back as World War I that I'm aware of. What exactly qualifies a civilian? The argument being that some person working in a shop may not be some horribly evil person and may or may not qualify as a civilian. Well, the argument is that they don't qualify as a civilian because that hammer that that metal that they're hammering into place is going to be used to build a tank, and therefore they are part of the industrial complex, the military industrial complex, and therefore they're okay target. You can just kill them as much as you want. No grief, it's okay. They're an acceptable target. I don't agree with that. I admit a lot of that's because of how I've been raised. Again, military family. I admit a lot of that's just because of how I tend to view life in general. And I understand that from a tactical military perspective, if you decide to limit yourself to not attacking what I have just defined as civilians, then you're going to severely hamper your ability to fight an economic or an industrial war. I don't frickin' care, though, because to me, those lives are more important than political gains. Sorry. And I'm not going to be ashamed about that. But I got a little bit off topic there. My point is, I feel like the worker caste themselves qualify, partially because of my reasoning earlier, partially because of how they've been presented as the civilians of the Minbari people, the Minbari culture. They are the everydays. They're the guys just trying to pay the bills. Kind of tying into that mundane thing earlier. And the idea of the worker caste running the government is interesting and wonderfully noble, wonderfully idealistic, and wonderfully naive. But at least it's something new. The old thing demonstrably didn't work, so hey, we're trying something new, right? It'd be interesting to see where they go with that. I like her bit, by the way, about this spot. The center spot is reserved for Naroon until the one who shall be comes. No comments on that. It's pure speculation. But here's the interesting thing. I want to share a quote with you, if you don't mind. I'm going to read it word for word so I don't mess it up. When the government violates people's rights, insurrection is, for the people and for each portion of the people, the most sacred of rights and the most indispensable of duties. I hope some of you recognize that quote. I bring that quote up because the Minbari Civil War has ended, and will at the very least be ended for some time. I sincerely doubt the Minbari will be willing to go after each other for years, if not decades, because of the severity of the change and the shift and what has happened with them. This entire time, there actually really hasn't been a full-scale Earth Civil War. Remember, we've been building up to these events. Now there's going to be. What's interesting is, no offense to the actress who plays Ivanova, but I feel like she didn't quite nail it when she came into the room and expressed her outrage. But Bruce Boxleitner did. He absolutely nailed what I was feeling. Because the Clark administration has taken the next step and murdered, not killed, murdered 10,000 plus fleeing civilians. And again, we could argue civilian definitions back and forth, but I'm pretty sure under these circumstances, refugees fleeing a war zone kind of qualify. They just flat out took them out. Acceptable targets. No, that is flat out war crime, and that is the kind of thing that really tends to piss off someone who adheres to military ideals, and we see that in Sheridan and in Ivanova. Because now they're going to war. Now they're actually going to take up arms and outright begin an insurrection against the Clark administration. Not a peaceful solution like they hoped for, not a propaganda campaign, not a political machination. It is time to pick up a gun and go fight. It's like I said last episode, civil wars are a mess. I'll see you next time, guys.